All right, so it's night 4 of 3, and we're ready to wrap it up. So I've been running about 6 pages of notes per night. I've only got like 2.5, so that doesn't mean I won't talk just as long, but I'll get outside of my notes really quick here. So we should be able to finish in a reasonable amount of time tonight. But before we get started, we always want to go to God in prayer, because this is His place and His time, and we want to make good use of it. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for giving us this opportunity to get together again, Lord. We thank you for the beautiful weather that we're having. It's gorgeous to look outside and see the patterns that you've set in place playing out, the flowers blooming and the grass starting to green up, and we're just grateful for it, Lord. We're grateful to be part of your creation, and we just pray tonight as we study your creation that it sinks into our heart, that our faith is increased, and that we become a better witness to others and better stand on our own faith. We just ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so I'm going to start tonight with it's kind of like talking about something we don't want to talk about, I guess. Talking about something that I wanted to get really excited about, and then I looked a little bit more into it, and I was like, darn, I can't get as excited about it as I wanted to. I'm putting it in here as a great example of what we have to kind of be careful about in all of these kinds of studies, because it's really tempting a lot of times when we see some really cool new stuff come out to just jump all over it. But sometimes it doesn't prove to be maybe quite as good as we wanted it to be. So I'm going to talk about one of those first. It's actually a great segue to some other things that we do want to talk about tonight. So there's this location at Mount Ebal, which is, it's a reference actually back to Joshua chapter 8. So Joshua, after conquering Jericho, the Israelites went to the city of Ai, or Ai, and they were going to conquer it, and they thought, oh, well, Jericho was such an easy conquering, and Ai is such a smaller place, we'll be able to take that no problem. But they didn't really consult God about it first, and so it did not go well. And they had to kind of go back and reconfigure and get in God's will before they went back in to take the city. And then they took it, and afterwards, Joshua built an altar, and at the point where he built the altar, he's discussing with the people the law, and he actually read the law to them, and he made a new copy of the law there at the side of that altar, and he pronounced blessings upon the people of Israel and curses upon their enemies. And this site, the archaeologists found it in the 1980s. They found this site that they thought, oh, this could be the altar that we're looking at, but I don't know, it doesn't quite match the description. And then they got to scanning the site a little bit deeper and discovered there was an older altar underneath the existing altar. And when they found that, like that's the right time. It dates back to Joshua, and that would be kind of that Bronze Age. It fits in with the Bible. It works out really nice. And it would have been cool to be able to just like absolutely definitively confirm that was Joshua's. Well, this gentleman went back and was studying the debris from the archaeological dig. So it's kind of like a secondary investigation where they go back through all the stuff that the archaeologists have kind of sifted out and put aside, and sometimes stuff got missed. And you can kind of do a secondary screening of the stuff that comes off the site and maybe find some new things. And so I lost my back screen. Okay, it came back. It just kind of weirded me out. My wife was moving back there, and then my screen went black, and I was like, did that screen go black? Anyway, so they're digging through the secondaries, and this gentleman finds this little lead square, basically is what it is. And he's like, oh, this could be something good. And they couldn't open it. It looks as though it's a piece of lead that was folded together. And, you would like to unfold it, but if you do, you're going to absolutely ruin it and destroy it. And so they did this scan on it, and he was convinced by what they found in the scan that what we had found here was a Joshua-era tablet that had been written on and then folded up, and that it had the curses that it's talking about in Joshua 8, blessings on Israel, curses on the enemy. And like this was curses being written out to the enemy. And I was like, oh, that's really cool. What would have been cool about that if it were right? And it might be, but it probably isn't. What would have been cool about that is that we know that Moses wrote, because we have the Torah. We have the first 5 books of the Bible. And we know that Moses wrote them. So we have great confidence that God's people, as early as Moses and even going back before Moses, possessed writing. But the secular world doesn't know that. They don't confirm that. It's possible, but there's no like hard evidence of it. So if this tablet had been what we wanted it to be, that would have been really cool because it would have proven that they would have had it. This is what the Mount Ebal site looks like, and if you see that blue circle up at the top, that would be the Joshua era altar that was buried in underneath a subsequently later built altar. This is the lead tablet, which kind of looks like a really old saltine cracker. But here's so when they said, okay, well, we scanned it and we think it says curses, curses, curses upon you from Yahweh, something like that. It was basically what it said. I was like, oh, that's cool. But then when you actually see the writing, so on the inside cover, there's nothing. But on side B, so if you crack it open on the right-hand side, this is kind of the shapes. And you notice the letters, if they are indeed letters, are not in any kind of nice. They're not in rows. They're not in any kind of order. Some of them are really large and some of them are really small. I don't read ancient Hebrew, but that looks kind of like a mess to me. And so a lot of other kind of archaeological experts have said it could be writing. And it could be just really roughed up tablet that's just been banged on a lot, and you can kind of see characters in there if you want to, but it's also possibly just a really banged up piece of lead. And it's also possible that it is writing, but it is not Hebrew and it's some other language, because there's a lot of other languages around there that kind of have similar characters. And so it doesn't meet the burden of proof. This is a great thing if it is what this one particular archaeologist thinks it is, because it would be proof that God's people possessed writing back, in an earlier day than the secular world has as of yet confirmed. But the fact of the matter is, you and I know Moses possessed writing because we have his writing. We have Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, and we know that Moses wrote them, and we don't really need any archaeological confirmation. It would be cool, but it's not absolutely necessary. And this is one of those things that, some creation websites will jump all over this and publish it like it's true. And it might be, but again, it might not be. Now, that does bring up a topic that I would like to kind of talk about tonight. Because like I said, tonight's a little bit of a grab bag, so I'm sort of picking some things from different periods, but I think this whole thing kind of stitches together into one story really, really nicely. We can't confirm that this tablet's genuine. We know Moses wrote. How far back does writing actually go? Is a good question. It would be interesting to know. And we don't know definitively the answer to that question. But the place where we and the secular world get off track with one another is that they are operating from a worldview that is based on the idea that the earth has been here for billions and billions of years and people have been here. I think they think that human beings separated from apes like 3 or 4 million years ago. And so they've got all this time that they need to fill in. That, there were monkeys, and then monkeys became people, but they were still like hairy people that drug their arms around and clubbed each other in the head and drag each other around by their hair and stuff. And so obviously they didn't possess writing and language and all this kind of stuff. And it wasn't until much later that mankind possessed language. Okay, but we operate from a completely different worldview, and our worldview was that we were created adult and intelligent and capable, that Adam was created capable, like a smart guy. And I have no problem with the idea that Adam could have been writing right from the very get-go. The Bible doesn't tell us whether or not Adam wrote. It doesn't tell us whether Adam's children wrote. But I don't think it's unreasonable to assume that they could. And I don't have any problem with that. So anyway, something to talk about. We know Moses could write. Did Moses, when he wrote the Torah, have access to written documents? Maybe. I don't think that's unreasonable. If you have had the opportunity to go to the Ark encounter, if you haven't, I'm going to bring it up a couple times tonight because there's a couple things that they've done there that I think were really clever. But if you do get to go through it, and what I mean is that big ark that they built in like northern Kentucky that Answers in Genesis people built that thing. If you get the opportunity to go through it, it's a cool deal. And one of the things they put in there was like a desk area for Noah, and you can see where he was like, doing his paperwork and stuff, because it would have probably taken quite a bit of organization to, run the ark for a whole year. And he had scrolls all rolled up and put in all these little cubbies, and I thought that was a really neat little add-on that they were putting in there that Noah was carrying, writing around, and I think that's absolutely likely that was the case. But here's a cool thing, in case you didn't know. Again, it's grab bag, so I get to talk about whatever I want to tonight. The Torah itself, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, are not merely a written account of Israel's history and everything that God wanted to know. They're also preserved as a song. So they would have had them in written form, but it was also a daily practice. Well, 3 times a week, the Torah was being read out loud. So people would have heard it read out loud in its entirety many, 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 many times over the course of their life. And, they didn't have podcasts, and they didn't have Netflix, and they didn't have Facebook and stuff to distract them. So what better thing do they have to do all day? But people to get up and just read the Bible in its, in its entirety. And so they were hearing the first 5 books of the Bible read all the time. And it was something that could be done to song. So they actually chanted or recited the Torah with rhythm and meter, and you would have learned, even without trying, just being alive in their culture, you would have learned significant parts of the Torah just because you were around it all the time. So this early period writing of God's word is very, very, very well preserved. Whether it's written, whether it's orally kept, whether it's something that was just being recited, it was something that all of God's people at the time would have known very, very, very well. And I didn't know if you knew that it was retained as a song. Jennifer and I got the opportunity when we were in college to go to a Jewish temple, and the rabbi there unrolled a scroll and shared that. Kind of read from a portion of Genesis and sang it. Now, it's not a song in the sense that it's always going to sound exactly the same. It's not like, this particular album or whatever, like a particular track. And whether it was read by morning, afternoon, or night, they had kind of different flavors to the way they presented it. So like the tune of it might be different, or in one area it might be to kind of a slightly different tune than it was in another area, but they kind of kept the same inflection on the same parts of the words and stuff. So anyway, it would have been very, very familiar to you. So that's just kind of a cool thing to know. God's word was preserved orally. It was also preserved in a written form, and it's been preserved as long back as we can probably imagine. And I don't have any problem thinking that when Moses wrote the Torah down, he didn't have some written records to go with as a result of that. Okay, so that kind of bridges over to cavemen. So how do cavemen fit in the biblical story? Because these are kinds of questions that sort of came up as we were talking about this stuff. We were talking about the flood. What's the pre-flood world look like? What's the post-flood world look like? Were there ever at any point cavemen? And if there were or weren't, how does the Bible deal with that? And once again, we get back down to an issue. The reason why cavemen pop up in the story is because the secular world has an enormous amount of time where they have people who ought not be intelligent because they're supposed to have been monkeys that became people. And so these monkey to people transition people clearly, wouldn't have had advanced communication skills, probably didn't carry on long, deep conversations, and probably weren't writing things down, right? But we don't need that time is as far as we know, as far as the Bible tells us, that time is fictitious. That's not real. There was never any time where people were transitioning from a monkey to a man. So that means without that need for some missing link, there's no need for this lack of intelligence. The reason why you don't read about caveman in the Bible is because I don't think there were any cavemen. I don't think there's any need for them. And I'll kind of show you some things here. So what we have on the left is a Neanderthal skull. And when you compare a Neanderthal skull, so a Neanderthal is supposed to be kind of one of the early, I'm not a monkey anymore, I'm totally a dude now, dudes. And so on the left here, you see them. And if you you can't really compare them very neatly. I try to find the best looking Neanderthal skull I can for these slides, but it's still not a perfect thing. But if you put them side by side, a typical human skull and a Neanderthal skull, what you'll notice is there seems to be a smaller brain cavity. So it's like the spot in our skull where our brain lives, there's just not as much room in a Neanderthal skull as there is in a typical human skull. The shape of the jaw is a little different. It's a little bit more forward. They kind of have a little bit more pronounced, almost like upper lip area. And you look at that and you're like, okay, well, I can see how a scientist might look at that and say, oh, well, that's like an earlier version of a person, and maybe it looks like it sort of came from a chimpanzee or a baboon or something like that. It actually doesn't work out at all. If you actually look at the skull carefully, if you flip it over and look at it from the bottom side, the human row of teeth is kind of a nice spread out U shape. In a chimpanzee or any other primate, the teeth are actually like a U shape. The jaw is to look at it from the front, it doesn't look that different. But if you actually flip it over and look at it from the bottom side, it is crazy different. They're not similar at all. The shape of the general skull and jaw and cheekbones and all that is completely different. What's interesting is the skull in the middle is a modern Aboriginal Australian skull. So these are people who just are native to Australia, not the British prisoners that got hauled over there through the 1700s, but the actual native people of Australia. They're Indians, if you will. They have a very different kind of head shape. And there's a lot more in common between like a Cro-Magnon man skull or a Neanderthal skull, one of these supposedly early humans, and an Aboriginal skull than there is between those and what we would consider to be a typical human skull. But the thing is, Aborigines are perfectly normal people, like you would expect. Like, they're intelligent folks that watch Netflix and listen to podcasts, and the world is all kind of the same no matter where you go now, right? Like, you still see stuff, you see imagery that makes you think that people are still running around half naked in parts of the world, like out in the jungle somewhere or something, and maybe there are a handful somewhere, but for the most part, everybody just wears Levi's and Under Armour hoodies and listens to podcasts and watches Netflix. Everybody does. So the world's kind of become more homogenous in that way. An Aboriginal Australian skull, if you dug that up and we'd never seen one before, I guarantee you they would say, oh, this is an early human. It's not an early human. That's absolutely ridiculous. And on that note, so a Neanderthal, an Aboriginal Australian, a typical human, these are all going to belong to skeletons that are somewhere in the upper 4 foot to low 6 foot range. So anywhere from like 4'9", 4'10", up through the 6 foot range. All of them will be like that. The missing links that they are kind of trying to sell us on with the evolutionary theory are not at all like that. So what we have here on the right is a typical human skeleton. In the middle is a chimpanzee, and on the left is Lucy. And if you don't know who Lucy is, she's the best missing link we've got, which is not impressive. What you'll notice about Lucy, and I don't know how much you can quite see there. Darlin, can you dim the lights here on the stage? It might help us see. Notice how some of her skeleton is brown and some of her skeleton is white. So this is what I was talking about from night one. All the time, we dig up stuff. We're like, oh, we just dug up a Schmerschnerfurschnerschnorus or something. And it's like a brand new dinosaur we've never seen before. Okay, well, we got like a finger bone, a leg bone, a cracked piece of a cranium, and 3 teeth. And we've reconstructed an entire dinosaur based on that. So what you're looking at here with Lucy, the brown stuff was actually found, and the white stuff is what we're guessing. Yeah. So there's more white than brown, you might notice. Now, some of that is kind of fair. So the right hip, if you have the right hip and the right femur, I think it's fair to say we can guess what the left hip and the left femur is going to look like. That seems fair. But there's very little rib and honestly very little skull that we have at all with Lucy. And one of the interesting things about her is that that hip is of vital importance, because that hip is supposed to be evidence of the change from monkey to man, because one of the big things about monkeys is they go around like this, not like this. And if you see chimpanzees trying to walk on 2 legs, it's clearly not their preferred way of getting around. It's kind of like watching my golden doodle walk around on 2 legs to try to get stuff off the counter. You know, it's kind of like, right? Like it's not, clearly not his favorite way to move about. So this hip is supposed to be a transition hip. The problem with it is when they dug up the piece of hip that they have, there's no evidence that that hip stands forward. It kind of looks like, shockingly, that hip would be in the same position that every other chimpanzee hip is in, which means it would have walked around on all 4s. The way that they get the hip upright, they looked at this hip bone and they said, oh man, this hip bone's got a lot of cracks and stuff in it. It looks like this hip got broken, and then when it was fossilized, it got fossilized maybe in a slightly different position than it would have been on the living creature. So you know what we'll do is we'll make a casting of this hip, and then we'll bust the casting up and we'll put it back together the way that it should have been, which is convenient that they know what that is. And the reason why they know what that is because they have a preconceived idea that this thing needs to be an upright walking critter, because we don't have any upright walking missing link monkey things, and this was a convenient opportunity to kind of re-engineer an ancient creature. Now, I followed this train for days. I really wanted to see. So Lucy is an Australopithecus africanus, which is like a fancy way of saying the Latin for what she is. The type of skeleton that they call this. And what I wanted to know is, how many of these skeletons do we have? And do we have a better hip now than we had back when we had Lucy? And the answer is, I would tend to think if we dug up a perfectly preserved hip on one of these suckers, and we actually could tell that it was an upright hip, it would be the #1 Google result for searching that thing. And the fact that it's not is a pretty good indication to me this is still the best one we've got. So I read something that said we've got like 300. I read another one that said 400 Australopithecus fossils now. I'm like, oh, great. I bet one of them had a hip in it. Best I can tell, no. I found 3 named Australopithecus fossils. I'm guessing you go to the trouble to name it if you feel like you've got a pretty complete thing to play around with. So there's Lucy, and then the other 2, I actually think there's 3. Their name is not interesting. It's like A117 and DB14 or something. And one of them is just a knee. And one of them is just some skull pieces. And they say they've got 300 or 400 of these partial skeletons, but they are not even telling me what kinds of bones they have, which makes me think it's a bag of broken pieces that we're going to just kind of sort of construct and assume probably belong to this species. Which tells me we still don't have a hip that actually proves this thing walked upright, which means it's chimpanzee. It's not a half monkey, half person. It's an all monkey, no person. And one of the more honest articles I found on it was like, what do we not know about Australopithecus so far? Well, we don't know for sure how much they walked upright. And we don't know if they didn't just spend most of their time in the trees. Sounds like a monkey, because I'm pretty sure that's what it is. It's just a monkey. So I say all that to say this. We're coming at this caveman question with a preconceived idea that the Bible is true. And if that's true, I don't need any cavemen. I don't need them. And so far, I've seen no good evidence that cavemen actually existed. So I don't need them. Now, evolution needs them in order for their story to be right. And so they're digging up things and they're saying, well, this could be. And they're right, it could be. But there's no evidence that it is. And you can kind of make up any story around a pile of bones that you want to. And if enough people say it enough times, then people kind of start to believe it. I had read kind of an angry exchange between some people on Reddit or something where they're like, well, obviously we've got like 300 of these things. Don't you think we know what the hip look like? And I was like, I would be interested to know. Because what happens is somebody reads an article and they say, oh, well, we've got 300 of these critters and this is what they behaved like. Well, then people just assume if you've got 300 samples, they must have found a more complete skeleton. But if they did, they're being really secretive about it. And I don't see why they would need to be secretive about it. So I don't think that's probably right. Okay, so this is kind of cool. These are some articles that I had found previously. I didn't search for any new ones because these were good enough for me and recent enough for me. But a 2012 article in the Smithsonian about cavemen being better at illustrating animals than today's artists. So one of the very first things that was ever filmed with a camera was a horse running. Because two dudes had a bet. And one guy bet that a horse always has at least 1 foot on the ground when it's running. And the other dude bet that I bet there's a point at which a horse is running and all 4 feet are off the ground at the same time. And this is how science happens. Two guys get in a bet and like invent a camera to satisfy the bet. I don't think they actually invented the camera to satisfy the bet, but they were like, you know, Ted's got a camera. Let's get a horse and let's film this thing. And what they found is, yes, in fact, when horses run, all 4 feet are off the ground at the same time. So that satisfied the bet, and one guy had to pay up, I guess. I assume that's how that worked out. There are behaviors that animals have when they are in motion that are just kind of weird, like you wouldn't think of it that way. When you're drawing horses in your notebook in school, you never probably draw them with all 4 feet off the ground because it just doesn't seem very realistic. And sometimes we see cave paintings of animals like, well, animals don't really look like that. And then when you actually analyze them in motion, running, you're like, oh, they actually do look like that. You ever seen like a dog with its face out the car window and then somebody does it in slow motion? Like, oh, wow, it looks like his face is completely warped into a really... Well, if somebody paused it right at that moment and drew that exact thing, you'd be like, that's not a dog. Well, they do really look like that. So because these cave people... They're not cave people, right? They're just people who drew pictures on cave walls because they didn't have anything else to do with their free time. They spent all day hunting and studying animals. They know what they look like. They know it even better than we do because we have other things to do with our time besides just analyze the running pattern of an antelope. And they actually did a better job of illustrating it than we do today. Neanderthal remains, they find inside their, stuck up in between their teeth and in gut remains and stuff sometimes, they find that they were basically like everybody's mom now. They used oils and plants and stuff to heal each other. So they were the original essential oil distributors. Neanderthals were making medicine. I thought these were supposed to be dumb cave people who were like thug and ugh and chug, clubbing each other over the head and stuff. No, they were not. They were humans. They were fully intelligent people who were probably really, really capable. They just had skulls that look a little different than what we consider to be a typical human skull today. But they got along just fine. Stone Age mystery. Cavemen were smarter than we thought. Yeah, obviously. Because they weren't really cavemen at all. They were just people, just smart people, who just looked a little different, whose skulls were shaped a little differently than what we consider to be a normal human skull today. Okay, so another topic here. We talked about in the flood, somebody had brought up the question about dinosaurs and how did dinosaurs really fit in this. Did Noah put dinosaurs on the ark and all that kind of stuff? So here's what we know. Because again, you got to just kind of strip everything back to what do we really know? The Bible doesn't specifically talk about, dinosaurs with the word dinosaur, because we didn't invent that word until like the mid 1800s. It doesn't say anything about brontosauruses or stegosauruses or triceratops or any of that kind of stuff. We do know that we dig these suckers up sometimes. So we've dug up dinosaurs. They clearly did exist. It's not a conspiracy hoax or something, somebody planting bones in the ground to mess us up or anything like that. These were actual critters. So then that makes us think they must have been alive on planet Earth at some point. And if they were alive on planet Earth at some point, they had to be alive at the same time people were alive, because we believe that animals and people were created by God in the same 6-day period, right? So they had to have lived together. That just stands to reason. So we then have to kind of look at the evidence and say, well, does the evidence support that? Did Noah take dinosaurs on the ark? Yeah, absolutely. He would have had to have, because they were living critters at the time. So yeah, he would have put them on the ark. Well, how do you get a brontosaurus or a T-Rex on the ark? The same way you get an elephant on the ark. You take a juvenile. I wouldn't take a full-grown African elephant. That just sounds dumb. I mean, if you've got all the modern technology we have today to transport an African elephant, okay. He didn't have a tranquilizer gun or a cattle prod or any of that cool stuff. He didn't have a whole team of people helping him either. I would say Noah absolutely did take him, and he probably took juveniles. And that's absolutely fine. No reason why he couldn't have done that. If you go on the Ark encounter and you walk through there, they've actually gone to the trouble to sculpt a number of juvenile dinosaurs, and they've got them in little pens. It's just a sculpture, but they look really convincing. I actually had a photograph of one I took when we were there that I should have put in here. I just didn't think to do it, but it doesn't matter. It's like a little ankylosaur. But so yeah, absolutely. There's no reason why you would think that Noah wouldn't have taken them on there. We also know Job talks about what appear to be dinosaurs in the book of Job. Job would have been post-flood, but very, very early. So the book of Job is probably the earliest book of the Bible. So now Moses talks about the beginning of time. So Moses is writing about a period earlier than Job, but he's not writing from his own personal experience. He's writing what he's been inspired to write by God, and maybe what written records he had to work with, and the oral tradition of the Hebrew people to work with when he wrote it. But Job's book is just literally very, very old. It doesn't talk about Abraham. It doesn't talk about the law. It doesn't talk about Israel, because it's pre all of that. It's way before all of that. But what does Job talk about? He talks about Behemoth and Leviathan, and he actually talks about them back to back. They're right there in the scripture together. I think it's Job chapter 15 and 16, if I'm not mistaken. But what he said about them, I wrote it down. I just kind of did some highlights. The behemoth eats grass like an ox, but has a tail like a cedar. His bones are like bronze tubes, and his limbs are like bars of iron. So the kind of depiction we're sort of tempted to think of, when you think of a tail as a cedar, it just makes you think of something that looks like a brontosaurus. And it probably was something that looked like a brontosaurus. And we believe, based on the skulls of brontosauruses, that they were plant-eating critters. So the fact that he ate grass like an ox, that makes sense. It talks about him living among the trees and laying down in the shade of trees and stuff like that. And that really matches what we would think to be the depiction of a sauropod, a brontosaurus or something like it. Job writes about Leviathan. It's an unruly creature that cannot be tamed. It's some sort of a sea serpent. It says that its back is a row of shields. A row of shields. So literally kind of making you think of a series of plates on its back, which seems just like a dinosaur. It talks about his belly being like shards of pottery, and that he cannot be harmed by swords or arrows or javelins or sling stones, that this guy is running the show and you cannot tell him what to do. And that just sounds like a dinosaur, like a sea-based dinosaur. So in Job's day, it must have just been commonplace. I mean, he's not writing about some crazy thing nobody's ever heard of before. He's like, you know Behemoth. This is God actually talking to Job. You know Behemoth, Job. Can you tame him? Can you put a bridle on him? Can you take Leviathan and catch him with your fish hook? Could you take him? I think it actually says something there. Would you put a rope on him and let your daughter lead him around? Like, no, of course not. And that's God reminding Job, I'm bigger than you. I'm stronger than you. I'm smarter than you. And I don't need your advice or help. Look at these other things I've made that are so much bigger and stronger and greater than you are. And I made them same way as I made you. You know, so, okay, so did Noah take dinosaurs on the ark? Yeah. Here's a cool fact about the ark. Based on what we know about its dimensions from the Bible, it had the capacity of about 483 semi-truck trailers. Can you fit a dinosaur in that kind of a volume? I think so. Yeah, I think you could. I don't see why you couldn't. Another thing that's kind of interesting about Noah, he probably would have only needed a total of around 6,700 animals on the ark. So we think about Noah needing 2 of everything, but he didn't need 2 of everything. He needed 2 of every kind. So Noah didn't need 86 different species of cats, you know, different subgenres of cats. He needed 2 cats. He didn't need every breed of dog. He needed 2 dogs. Right? And so when you really get to thinking about it, there's only like something like 1,800, 1,900, something like that, different kinds that probably needed to be represented on the ark. And all of the variation we get today, you know, we have Asian elephants and African elephants. We have the kinds of tigers you see in India and the kinds of tigers you see in other parts of Southeast Asia that are slightly different. We see, golly, hundreds of different dog breeds. All of that is probably the small changes in species that do happen, that happened after the flood was over with. So what Darwin observed, Darwin's not a dumb guy. You know, he saw one bird on one side of the island, he saw a bird on the other side of the island. He said, you know, these birds probably have a common ancestor. I think he's right. Birds can be different birds. Dogs can turn into different dogs. I have a golden doodle at home that didn't exist before the 1990s. Nobody had done that. Golden doodles weren't a thing. That's a breed they started in Australia back in the 1990s. And it, you know, it's no great scientific marvel. You take 2 dogs of different breeds and you breed them and you get something new, right? So this kind of stuff just happens in the natural world. You've got an animal that has certain features and you've got another animal of the same species that has very different features, and when they breed, you get even different kinds of critters as a result. And there's no reason why that doesn't explain, you know, African and Asian elephants and hundreds and hundreds of different breeds of dogs and stuff like that. So the point is, Noah has plenty of room on his ark to represent all of the kinds and still get dinosaurs on there too. So yeah, absolutely. I think he did take that. Now, here's kind of something interesting. So is there any evidence that people and dinosaurs occupied the earth at the same time? There is. Now, one thing that we've already discussed in here, we understand that the layers of dirt that we find on our planet are probably not the result of millions of years of time, because that doesn't line up with what the Bible says. What we believe all these layers of dirt and rock to be under our feet are flood deposits. You're not going to find human beings and dinosaurs buried in the same layer because they escaped the flood at different rates. we don't see human fossils in there at all. And it's not because humans didn't evolve until all of those layers were laid down. It's because humans were smart enough to last as long as anybody on the planet. No critter on Earth is more capable of surviving a flood than a human being. And so they just lived until the very end. And they died, and their bodies were exposed, and they didn't get fossilized. Right? Because they would have had to get buried and sediment be buried on top of them to be fossilized. They were smarter than that, right? So we're not going to find human fossils and dinosaur fossils in the same layers. We do occasionally find human footprints and dinosaur footprints in similar rock layers or in the same rock layers, or in one case in New Mexico and one case in Glen Rose, Texas, literally a dinosaur footprint and a human footprint in the same mud, one overlaying the other. And of course, you know, the secular world really doesn't know what to make of those particular fossils. The one in Glen Rose is a very clear three-toed dinosaur footprint, and there is a human footprint on top of that footprint. It kind of smashes two of the three toes of that dinosaur toe. But what you can tell from the footprint, I should have put the picture of it in there, but it's a human foot. It's kind of hard to see, honestly, on a screen like this. But Google it. You'll find just Glen Rose, Texas, human dino footprint. You'll find it. It's clearly a human foot, and you can see the big toe is like a really deep hole. Like the person rolled their foot forward, and their big toe kind of sunk down in the rock layer. And what secular scientists, they look at that like, well, it kind of looks like a human foot, but it's not. See, like that's not a human toe. A human toe wouldn't make an impression like that. And you're like, they would if they just rolled their foot forward. But they need an explanation for why that can't be. That has to be weathering that just happens to kind of look like a human foot or whatever. You'll even see explanations where there's human footprints over here in the rocks, and there's no dinosaur footprints there, but there's dinosaur footprints over here, and it's the same layer, which makes you think it happened at the same time. And like, oh no, that didn't happen at the same time. And they've actually got like pictures in the museums of like an upright ape walking, leaving human footprints behind. Like, whatever you need to do to make your story work, man. You know, it's fine. So here we have some examples. So on the left, the thing at the top, I don't know what it is, but the thing at the bottom looks an awful lot like a stegosaurus. It's a four-legged thing with a tail, and it clearly has plates on its back. It looks an awful lot like a stegosaurus. That is a kind of a early medieval relief from a temple in Cambodia. I think I wrote the name of the temple down so that I could tell you what it was. It's from the Khmer Empire, and it's called the Monastery of Ta Prohm, which is really interesting. And of course, once again, the secular world looks at that and they say, oh, well, you know, elsewhere on that temple, there are other carvings of like, you know, mythical creatures and stuff. So that's probably just a mythical creature. Or maybe, I saw one of the explanations, that's a giant pangolin. And a pangolin, if you don't know what that is, it looks like an armadillo, basically. Just with scales instead of plates. If you've ever seen an armadillo, which I'm sure you have, living here in rural Missouri, a pangolin is an Asian armadillo-looking thing, but instead of having just big bands on its back, it's got little individual, like, scale-looking plates. And it looks literally nothing like that at all. It's the fact that you could say, oh, that's probably just a giant pangolin. Like, no, it'd be like you seeing a carving of a horse and be like, well, it's a dog. It's not, though. It's clearly not. So, yes, there may be elsewhere on that temple some carvings of some other mythical creatures. I never saw any of those carvings. All the pictures I saw were of this particular door frame, and every single thing on that door frame is a human being, an animal that doesn't look crazy at all. Looks like it could be like, I don't know if that's supposed to be a bear or a dog or what up there on the top, but whatever it is, it doesn't seem like a great stretch of the human imagination to think that they probably saw that. Everything else in that column is just like people. So why you would think that this one thing out of that entire column was somehow mythical when everything else seemed very literal is sort of hard for me to understand. It appears to be like these people had just seen a stegosaurus before and just carved one in there. There was also, I couldn't put every single one of these, we'd be here all night, but there was a guy that found some sculptures in some ancient Greek area, and there was a sculpture that was very clearly a stegosaurus. It was all stretched out, but I mean, it had a neck and a back and a tail and scales all the way sticking up all the way along it. It's like, yeah, they probably just saw a stegosaurus, man. Is that hard to think? Over here on the right, what you're seeing are a couple of different depictions from Utah. These would have been petroglyphs, so like paintings on a cave wall that are found in Utah by the Anasazi Indians, Native Americans, here in North America. Makes you think that they had seen a brontosaurus before, because it sure looks like one. Does that definitively mean they saw a brontosaurus? No. But again, it's a matter of how do you want to interpret the evidence. If you're a secular scientist and you believe there's 300 million years between the last dinosaur and the first person, then you have to look at something like this and say, oh, well, it's just mythology, or oh, well, it's just convenient. Maybe that's just a blob on the rock and it kind of looks like a thing, but it wasn't really intended to be a thing at all. Maybe it was several different drawings that all kind of got blended together and it looks like a dinosaur now. You could think that. And they might be right. But from our worldview, knowing that people and dinosaurs had to inhabit the earth at the same time, it just seems clear, like they saw a brontosaurus, they painted a brontosaurus. Is it that hard to imagine? And again, Google it. Spend some time looking it up. You will find tons and tons and tons and tons of examples of pottery and sculpture from all over the planet and paintings and stuff where people have depicted what looks an awful lot like what we would think a dinosaur would look like, and I gotta think it's because they saw them. It just seems reasonable to me. This is a very famously traded mosaic. This was found, it's believed to date back to about 100 BC. It was found in Rome, and it's called the Nile Mosaic of Palestrina. Now, what's really cool about this one, I saved this one for last on depictions. So what we have up here in the top, it looks kind of dinosaur-like. It sort of looks like what we would expect, something, velociraptor-y or something like that, Spinosaurus or something, kind of laying down here. You can see his head turned. You can kind of see he's got real sharp teeth. And there's a bunch of people with shields around making you think they're a little bit worried about this dude. What I think is super cool about this particular one, and I actually saw a guy who had put this picture up on his website and was like, creationists make a big deal about this like it's a dinosaur. He's like, it's probably just an otter. Well, that's interesting because, one, it doesn't look like an otter. I've seen an otter. It doesn't look like that. Another is that Greek up there says crocodile leopard. Crocodile leopard, which sounds nothing like what I would use to describe an otter. But I might use that to describe something that kind of was lizard-like. Kind of crocodile-like, but it's also kind of not like a crocodile. It's almost like, I don't know, some sort of weird lizard cat. Okay, yeah, lizard cat, scary lizard cat that might sneak up on you and like bite your throat out in your sleep or something. Okay, cool. Yeah, it sounds like a dinosaur, and it looks like a dinosaur, which means people maybe just recorded dinosaurs. Doesn't every culture on Earth have stories about dragons in their history? Where do you think all these people came up with all these stories? Probably because they saw them. And the only reason why we should ever dismiss all of this, the only reason to dismiss every single culture's tradition about St. George slaying a dragon, or the native people in South America seeing a feathered serpent that they call Quetzalcoatl, the only reason to dispute any of that, say, oh, well, that's just mythology, is only because the secular world says there's 200 or 300 million years between dinosaur and people. But that timeline we've already established in here is completely made up. There's nothing about that measurement of time that gives us any indication that it's scientifically accurate. So what do you want to believe? A made-up time scale that we absolutely know is not super valid, or the testimony of thousands of people from human history that just recorded this stuff? They didn't make any special effort to record it because it wasn't specially weird to them, because they saw this stuff all the time. Like, well, you know, dragons, they live over there. You know what I'm talking about. We had to go kill one. Oh, well, yeah, you got to kill dragons. Like, you just do. Like, it wasn't special to them to think about it as something weird. China, of course, has dragons. We know that. In Mesoamerican culture, there's Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, which is a big, flying, feathered serpent. And, you know, they keep telling us, probably some dinosaurs had feathers. Okay, I can buy that. People in South America seem to think so I'm cool with that. The Norse have a critter, it's a sea serpent called Jormander. In England, they have, their dragons a lot of times have arms, which maybe they're just really bad at drawing them. And it was like little bitty T-Rex arms, and they kind of overdid it. Or maybe they did have arms. They call them wyverns. In ancient Sumeria, there was a critter called Kur, which was a giant water serpent. Of course, our Native Americans, we saw them just now painting pictures of like a brontosaurus. But obviously, they have stories of like the thunderbird, the phoenix, stuff like that. No reason to think that those things aren't actual things that actually lived at some point, and we just don't see them now. Why don't we see them now? What happened to dinosaurs that they're all extinct now when they used to live before? Well, a couple things. One, and most significantly, the post-flood world is vastly different than the pre-flood world. I mean, we talked about that. We spent a whole night talking about how absolutely cataclysmic the flood was. And what we know about dinosaurs from looking at their skeletons is that they had really big bodies and a lot of times really small nostrils. So we have every reason to believe that Earth, pre-flood, probably had a very different composition of atmosphere. So it's probably the case that there was a lot higher concentrations of oxygen in the atmosphere. We know human beings used to live much longer lives, because the Bible records people living hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And we know that really, really, really big critters used to live on the planet. And we know that some humans were really big critters too. The Bible talks about giants that were, well over 10 foot tall. So, okay, we used to have a world where there were bigger things that were supported by an earth that was composed differently than the earth that we live in today. So part of the reason why dinosaurs died out is probably because the world wasn't as hospitable to really, really big critters as it once was. Because the atmosphere changed. All the volcanism and, the new chemistry must have just been hard for them to survive. And then, pre-flood, we know, the Bible tells us, that people did not eat meat. And it appears as though, animals weren't trying to kill us, and things survived on eating plants. Well, after the flood, we're able to kill and eat critters, and critters are able to kill and eat one another. And so dinosaurs become a much bigger threat. Something that before was a peaceful thing you didn't really have to worry about, now is something that you have to worry about. And that means people would have had reason to not want to coexist with dinosaurs. And we read a lot of brave stories about people willing to fight a dragon. Well, okay. So people fought dragons because they were killing livestock, and they were, same reason we kill coyotes. It's not that we got something against coyotes, but they've got something against baby calves. So they got to go. Even if they have really cute relationships with roadrunners and build really cool and hilarious traps that I enjoy watching. We just can't live together. It just doesn't work out. And probably the same thing with humans and dinosaurs. Okay, now, to totally shift gears in my last few minutes here, I want to share with you some really, really cool, I've been saving this for last because I think this is like nail in the coffin for evolution stuff that I'm just saving right here until the end. But some recent science that really confirms our ideas of the age of the earth. So I'm going to move through these. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on them, but I just kind of want to talk to you about these. So this first one that I want to talk about, it says chimp DNA up on the screen. So in 2018, there was a study by a man named Richard Buggs, which is a great name. He's a professor and an evolutionary biologist for Queen Mary University of London. He is not a Christian. He's a secular science guy. You may have heard before that human DNA and chimpanzee DNA is like 99% similar. And that is not true. So this gentleman believed in the early 2000s, around 2006, 2007, we were starting to get some really good work, getting very close to having the human genome completely sequenced. And at the same time, we were working on sequencing the genome of other animals, including chimpanzees. And so there were people who were very anxious to line the two up and just see how similar we were, because obviously we must have evolved from the same thing, right? So clearly there's going to be a lot of similarity in the DNA. And there were people working on that. Even back in the 90s, there were people working on that. And that's when, in the 90s, we came up with this, oh, well, human DNA and chimp DNA is 99% similar. And so when this new science is coming out in the early 2000s, this gentleman, who is a biologist by trade, a molecular biologist, is reading this stuff, and he's like, you know, this makes me think what we're reading about human DNA and what we're reading about chimp DNA, I think we're going to find they are way less similar than advertised. And he's not got an axe to grind because he's not trying to prove evolution is not true. He believes evolution is true. He just sees the writing on the wall. And so he said, I sat down and I did the math, and he gave some speeches. He said, I really think as we study this more, we're going to find, he goes, I bet human DNA and chimp DNA is something more like 70% the same. Not 99%. And he missed it by a little bit. By the time the science got good enough that he could actually sit down in his own lab and work it out, he determined that chimpanzee DNA and human DNA is 84.38% similar. About 85%. A creation biologist that works for the Institute for Creation Research did a similar study, but not exactly the same. He used different elements in his study, but he came to the exact same conclusion, 85%, 84 point whatever percent similar between human DNA and chimp DNA. Does that matter? Yes. Yes, it does. And here's why it matters. One, you ought to know, you share 60-some% of your DNA with a chicken. You also share about 60% of your DNA with a banana. A banana. So if you're 60% like a chicken or a banana, being 80% like a monkey is really unimpressive, is it not? It actually would need, for evolution to be true, for the time scale, see, and here's the thing that I wish we could all wrap our minds around, and I can't do it either, but every single one of these things we talk about, there's this secular scientific explanation, I put in big quotes, for how this happened. And then there's an explanation for how this happened. And there's an explanation for how this happened. But none of the stories match. None of it goes together. So there's this whole thing. Well, humans and chimps separated about 3 or 4 million years ago. Okay, if our DNA was 99 point something percent similar, you could maybe think that there's enough time in 3 or 4 million years for enough genetic change to happen to turn a chimpanzee into a person. But if we're only 85% similar, you're going to need tens and tens and tens of millions of years to get that much change. It doesn't work. Every time we get a new piece of information, we work it out into some kind of theory, but that theory now is incompatible with the geology, it's incompatible with this other DNA study, it's incompatible with population studies. None of these stories are the same story. Our story is always the same story, and it always works together if you start from our perspective. Got up there, genetic mutations. So that study, the Richard Buggs study, was in 2018. In 2012, there was a secular science study published in both Nature magazine and Science magazine, which those are publications for people to just publish findings that they have. They sequenced protein coding genes in humans, and they found that the human genome is devolving, unsurprisingly. It's getting worse. It's picking up mutations that are not favorable, right? Which we would expect. We would expect God created something perfect, and over time it has slowly gotten worse. Evolution tells us that it's getting better. Well, it's not. And it's getting worse at a rate that makes it predictable that the human genome must be younger than 10,000 years old. It has to be younger than 10,000 years old, or it would have picked up so many mutations that we would all be crawling around, like we wouldn't be capable of anything anymore because our genome would be so broken down. So it has to be less than 10,000 years old, which really messes things up because human beings were supposed to have come out of Africa like 200,000 years ago. And we were supposed to have evolved from a monkey 4 million years ago. So the whole genome thing is a real problem, isn't it? You'll notice on the screen, mitochondrial Eve. A secular scientist group did a study back in the late 1990s, and then a guy named Robert Carter redid the study in 2018. Robert Carter is a creationist. The original people doing the study were not. And what they said was, okay, so you have something called mitochondrial DNA. So you have DNA in your body's cells. That is the complete version of your DNA. But then outside of your body's cells, you've got these little energy factories called mitochondria. And the mitochondria has its own little DNA loop. It's a shorter, like your DNA is made of millions and millions and millions of base pairs. This is like 15,000 base pairs. It's a very small piece of code, and it's in a perfect circle. And we like to study it because it's way cheaper to study mitochondrial DNA because it's shorter and it's easier to get to and it's easier to work with. And what they found is your mitochondrial DNA is inherited 100% from your mom if you're normal. There are a few people that get some dad stuff in there and it's weird, but anyway. You only get mitochondrial DNA from your mom, so that's handy. What they can do, and I don't fully understand how it works, but they can look in it and they can see exactly how many generations have transpired between samples. Because there is a very predictable change in the mitochondrial DNA. It's literally just like step by step by step. And for a long time, scientists looked at the mitochondrial DNA and they said, well, these steps must represent this amount of time because we know that human beings migrated out of Africa like 200,000 years ago. So they based everything off of that 200,000 year time. And then in the 1990s, some geneticists said, okay, but what would happen if we actually look at the mitochondrial DNA and we know how many steps between this person and this person? Like we literally know because we know both of these people. Or like this is somebody's great-great-grandfather and we have their DNA and we have this DNA. We know how many steps there are. What does that look like? And what happens if we take our actual observed time period between those steps and apply it to the oldest human fossils we can find? If we apply it to this whole time scale and we work it back and we see, okay, we see this many changes, how much time does that actually work out to be? If we don't put 200,000 made up years in it, if we just do it by what we actually observe, oh, well, that can't be right because that shows the human genome is 6,000 years old. 6,000 years old. That's exactly right. It's exactly supposed to be 6,000 years old. And they're like, well, that can't be right because obviously we know people have been around a lot longer than that. Oh, but they haven't. That is exactly on time with what the Bible tells us. Isn't it convenient that once we finally have the science to get a hard answer on a specific moment at which human beings seem to have, it's exactly what the Bible tells us it would be. The Bible that was written thousands of years ago, way before we could have conceived that any of this science would ever be possible. Isn't that cool? It's almost like it's true. Adam So there's mitochondrial Eve. What about, there's no mitochondrial Adam because mitochondrial DNA is mama DNA. So there's something we can do with the Y chromosome where we can date it as well. And so they did a Y chromosome Adam. Okay, well, we know what this mitochondrial Eve worked out to be 6,000 years. Let's see what we get when we do a similar thing with the Y chromosome. And they tested the Y chromosome against population studies, and they found it dated to 6,000 years. How about that? It's almost like all of this science is pointing back to the same original origin point. Isn't that cool? You know, planet Earth has like 7 billion people on it right now. And if you go back in time, population growth is exponential. So a few million people quickly become a few billion people. And if you dial it back and you say, okay, well, based on what we see in populations and how much they exponentially grow over time, if we take that number back, how far back would that go? And what if we account for everything we can possibly think about, like major outbreaks of disease, because those happen on kind of somewhat regular basis, that there's going to be an outbreak of disease that's going to kill a certain amount of the population. What if we consider the rate at which human beings tend to give birth to twins? And what if we consider cultures that have polygamous relationships where one man may father children with multiple women? If we put all of that data in, and we really try to make a very, very good model, how far back would us having 7 billion people on planet Earth today, how far back does that go? And where would it start? You want to know something really cool? It works out perfectly for the math for it to be 4,500 years ago. Now, wait a minute. I thought human beings have been around 6,000 years. Yeah, but what happened 4,500 years ago? A flood wiped out the entire population of planet Earth. If you go back exactly, well, roughly 4,500 years, and you have 3 breeding pairs, as in Shem and Ham and Japheth, Noah's children, it works out perfectly. In 4,500 years, 3 breeding pairs should generate a population that is exactly what Earth's population is today. 4,500 years, and human beings were supposed to have come out of Africa 200,000 years ago today. What happened to all the people? And they're the people who don't think dinosaurs were walking around eating them. I mean, they're the people with the dinosaurs, like, oh, well, it's just the dinosaurs eating everybody. That's probably the problem. They're the ones with the problem. We don't have a problem. Our population study works out absolutely just fine. 3 breeding pairs 4,500 years ago. Not 3 to 4 million years ago from an ape. Not 200,000 years ago out of Africa. That's pretty cool. I got one last one for you. Journal of Human Evolution in 2018 published this study. They did the largest DNA study ever. They tested 100,000 different species of animals, including humans. They did the mitochondrial DNA on every single one of them to try to figure out how far back does this species go. And here's what's really cool. Every single species appears to have emerged at the same time. And they have no common ancestors. Dogs seem to have emerged 6,000 years ago. And lizards and frogs and fleas and I forget what, tube worms and human beings all seem to have just suddenly appeared 6,000 years ago. How about that? And there's no common ancestor. There's no point at which chickens came from cats, that came from tube worms, that came from tadpoles. It's almost like everything was created in its kind about 6,000 years ago. And then something really crazy happened 4,500 years ago that wiped everything out, and it all had to start over again. I know why. Because the book we've been reading for thousands of years tells us exactly why that is. And you can come up with some sort of crazy explanation for a way to explain these rocks, and a way to explain these bones, and a way to explain this phenomenon. But every single one of those explanations is completely independent of one another, and they don't line up together. One kind of dating that we can do on this particular element doesn't at all match the numbers we get from another kind of dating, and it doesn't match at all what we see in the archaeological record, which doesn't match at all what we see. But if you just think the Bible's true, it all works just fine. As long as you don't abracadabra a million years in there anytime that you feel like you want to. And just paste this thing together out of stuff that you want it to be. So, in conclusion, what I want you to take away from all of this, I want you to be undergirded in your faith and know that the Bible is true, and you don't have to feel unintelligent or unscientific to believe that it's possible that the earth is just really young. And that a flood really happened, and it was a global flood, and it wiped everything out, and we all had to start over. And the science actually confirms that. The science matches our story a whole lot better than it does any other story that people are coming up with. It's all a matter of your worldview. Where did you start from? Did you start from the idea that the earth has been here 4 billion years ago, or did you start from the idea that God created it? Who has the authority? I don't know any of this stuff. I'm just going with what the Bible tells me, and what science is finding, and it works out that the two match up when people aren't being really creative with it, when they're just being straight. When they say, on this mitochondrial study, let's strip out the fictitious timeline we put in there, and let's just go with what we actually observe to be true. Well, then you get straight answers, and those straight answers match the Bible really, really perfectly. So what makes the most sense? Usually the simplest explanation is the right one. And the simplest explanation here is that the first-hand account, the eyewitness testimony that we started with on the first night of this thing, if somebody watches something happen, they watch a crime get committed, and we don't absolutely know that this person's testimony is trustworthy, we take it, we put it on the shelf, and then we find all the physical evidence we can, and we look. If the physical evidence matches the eyewitness testimony and it never refutes it, then everything that the eyewitness said might as well be true, because why wouldn't it be? In every way that we can verify their story, it checks out. So in all the ways we can't verify their story, there's no reason to think it doesn't. We have an eyewitness testimony. It tells us how the world got here. It tells us how this thing went down. And every single piece of scientific evidence we find, when we strip all the made up stuff out of it and we just take it for what it really says, it matches this story just fine. So there's no reason not to believe it. The simplest explanation seems to be what's right. And you ought to be able to walk out with confidence knowing that. And don't let anybody make you feel dumb about it. They're not dumb either. They've just been misguided on the worldview part. And there's so many people reading what's in the textbook and listening to what the professor said and reading what this study or this paper or whatever says, not knowing that it all rests upon really big assumptions. Just like that hip bone, right? We got 300 of these Australopithecus fossils. Does any one of them have a complete hip that actually shows us this thing walked upright? No. But nobody says that. They just say, oh, well, Lucy walked upright. Didn't you guys have to break that hip? We've got 300 or 400 of these things. Okay, but you didn't answer the question. Do you have an upright hip? And the answer is most of the people who've read the studies, honestly, probably don't know. Because they don't realize they're resting their hope, their understanding on an assumption. It seems like a fact, but it's not a fact. And there's so much of that there's no reason for you to feel dumb about what you believe. There's no reason for you to feel uneducated. The Bible is true. We know it is. We shouldn't be surprised when we find out that it is. So, I want you to walk out of here tonight feeling good, feeling like your faith is well backed up by every single piece of late-breaking evidence. Here we are. Most of the stuff we talked about tonight, 2012 and 2018. This is all new stuff. And new science, the best science we've got is confirming what we always knew to be true. So I want you to have a lot of confidence about that. I promise we will do this again soon. I won't make it like 4 years between these things. I'll try to crack another one out before the end of the year. And who knows what kinds of cool things will be in it. If you guys read something, if you hear something, if you're curious about something, and you don't seem to be able to find the right information to figure it out, let me know. I may not be able to either, but I'm certainly willing to try. And I'm always looking for new sources because, you know, I'm used to reading certain things and listening to certain podcasts and watching certain people talk. And there's always new stuff out there that I don't know about. So if you come across something, share it. Because we can all benefit from that. And if there's more things that you want about a certain topic, odds are I've got like 100 gig of this stuff in a Google Drive folder. So I've got a lot of articles saved up and a lot of notes on a lot of things and a lot of books that I've read, and I'm happy to share any of that stuff with you. So if there's something you're passionate about, just let me know and I'll let you know if I've got anything on it. Cool? All right. Consider yourselves dismissed for not only tonight, but for the whole apologetics series here. Thank you very, very much for coming. I really appreciate your time, and I hope you feel like it's been well spent. All right. Thank you.